Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to share and subscribe the channel. Jason Ward never thought an interstellar university would feel this normal. The place was massive, a sprawling city of glass towers and floating walkways, with students from 100 different species walking, floating, or skittering past him. Some wore gravity harnesses, some shimmered out of phase with reality, and others had multiple limbs or bioluminescent skin. He had prepared for culture shock, but standing in the middle of the bustling campus, bags slung over his shoulder and trying not to stare too hard at the six-sided reptilian creature haggling over a vending machine snack, he realized no amount of study could have truly prepared him for this. He adjusted the digital badge pinned to his chest, which pulsed with his assigned dormitory location, Building 47A, Room 421, his new home for the year. A deep breath settled him as he moved forward, dodging a trio of levitating students engaged in a heated debate about quantum linguistics. He kept his head down, determined to make a good first impression. After all, he was representing Earth in the exchange program, and the last thing he needed was to be labeled as the awkward human who couldn't even handle basic intergalactic etiquette. His roommate, whoever they were, would probably already have enough preconceived notions about him. He needed to prove he wasn't some clueless primitive from a backwater planet. The dormitory was surprisingly sleek, tall, curved structures that gleamed under the twin moons. The inside was a strange mix of familiar and alien architecture, hallways wide enough to accommodate species of all shapes and sizes, with floating signs adjusting their script to whatever language the viewer spoke. Jason's door unlocked with a low chime as he approached, scanning his badge before sliding open to reveal his living space. It was surprisingly spacious, though clearly designed to house two species with wildly different needs. The room was split down the middle, one side held a standard human bed, a desk, and a closet, while the other was more exotic. A raised cushion platform covered in a dark, velvet-like material sat in the corner, surrounded by what looked like hanging silk drapes, giving it a more enclosed, den-like feel. The walls on that side were textured, marked with faint glowing patterns that pulsed rhythmically, almost like a living heartbeat. Jason barely had time to take it in before he heard a sound behind him, a soft, almost melodic hum, followed by the light shuffle of footsteps. He turned, eyes widening as he got his first look at his roommate. She was unexpected. He had braced himself for something truly alien, an amorphous blob, a creature with exoskeletons and mandibles, maybe even a tentacled life form that communicated through color shifts. Instead, he found himself staring at a tall, blue-skinned woman with large silver eyes that studied him with equal parts curiosity and weariness. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, framing delicate, almost feline features. She moved with an effortless grace, bare feet barely making a sound against the smooth floor, and behind her, a fluffy, cat-like tail twitched slightly, curling and uncurling as if reacting to some unspoken thought. He opened his mouth to introduce himself, but she beat him to it. "You're the human," she said, stating it as a fact rather than a question. Jason blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of the greeting. Yeah. Jason Ward," he replied, extending a hand out of instinct before remembering that handshakes weren't universal. He awkwardly pulled it back, stuffing it into his pocket. "You must be Salari." Her gaze flicked to his retracted hand before returning to his face, unreadable. "Yes," she said. Silence stretched between them, thick and slightly uncomfortable. Jason cleared his throat, shifting his bag to his other shoulder. "So, this is going to be interesting. I mean, cross-species dorm arrangements are probably meant to encourage cooperation, right?" He chuckled, trying to break the tension, but Salari didn't react. She tilted her head slightly, those silver eyes studying him with unnerving intensity before she finally spoke again. "Just don't touch my things." That wasn't exactly the warmest welcome, but Jason decided not to push it. "Got it, I like my personal space too." Another pause, then without another word, Salari turned and walked toward her side of the room, settling onto her cushioned platform with fluency. She curled her legs beneath her, reaching for a small, floating tablet-like device, her tail flicking once before curling around her waist like a protective shield. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. Well, that could have gone worse. He set his bag down, taking a moment to absorb the reality of the situation. His roommate was gorgeous, vaguely cat-like, and probably already regretting having to share a space with him. This was going to be a long year. Still, it could be worse, at least she wasn't trying to eat him. The next few days were a blur of orientation meetings, technology adjustments, and social minefields. Jason learned quickly that, while most students were open-minded, there was a strict divide between species when it came to relationships. The Intergalactic Cultural Preservation Act, a rule enforced by the university, explicitly forbade cross-species romance, claiming it was for the protection of both cultural identity and biological integrity. Some students followed the rule out of tradition, others, out of fear of the consequences. The punishment was severe: expulsion, deportation, and, in some cases, memory modification. Jason didn't plan on breaking the rule, but it still felt weirdly archaic. After all, if so many species had evolved together, shouldn't relationships naturally form? He wasn't about to test the system, though. He had one job: to learn, to experience, and to not get kicked out of the best intergalactic school in existence. Salari, on the other hand, remained an enigma. She wasn't cold exactly, but she kept her distance. Their conversations were short, usually limited to polite necessities. Jason caught her watching him sometimes, though she always looked away when he noticed her tail. However, it was a dead giveaway. It would twitch whenever he spoke to another female student, something he found both strange and oddly fascinating. At first, he assumed it was just a natural reflex, but when Era, another human exchange student, laughed a little too loudly at one of his jokes, he felt something soft and warm wrap around his wrist: Salari's tail. He glanced down, startled. She didn't seem to realize she was doing it. Her expression remained neutral as she scrolled through her tablet. Jason cleared his throat. Salari, she blinked, glancing at him then at her own tail, which was still looped around his wrist. A beat of silence passed, then her tail snapped back, like she had been burned. Salari's expression didn't change, but Jason swore he saw the faintest hint of a blush beneath her sapphire blue skin. She turned away sharply, her voice cool but hurried. It was an accident. Jason smirked. I'm not so sure about that. He tried not to think too much about what had happened with Salari's tail, but the moment replayed in his head more times than he wanted to admit. He told himself it was nothing, just an instinctive reaction, maybe even a biological quirk of her species. But the way she had pulled back, her usually composed expression faltering for just a second, made it hard to shake the feeling that it meant something more. He didn't press the issue, though. She clearly didn't want to talk about it, and considering they were barely getting along as it was, pushing her now seemed like a bad idea. Instead, he focused on settling into universal life, trying to get a handle on classes, campus customs, and the ever-present reality that he was one of the few humans in a place filled with beings far more advanced than him. The academic side of things was a mixed bag. Some classes were fascinating, like Xena's psychology, where he got to study how different species processed emotions, memory, and perception, while others were downright brutal, like quantum linguistics, which made his brain feel like it was being stretched into another dimension every time the professor explained a new grammatical structure that only existed in phase-time species. The technology at Vale and Prime made Earth's advancements look laughable, with floating holographic displays, real-time knowledge injections, and instantaneous neural downloads for students whose biology could handle them. Unfortunately for Jason, humans weren't compatible with half of the university's learning aids, so he had to do things the old-fashioned way: reading, memorizing, and hopping along. Socially, things weren't any easier. Most students were polite but distant, as if still deciding whether humans were worth their time. The few other humans in the exchange program stuck together when they could, but they were scattered across different dorms and departments, making it difficult to form a solid group. Era was the only one he saw regularly, mostly because they had a couple of classes together and she was one of the few people who didn't make him feel like an awkward outsider. She was easy to talk to, sharp-witted, and had a knack for making even the most intimidating alien professors seem less terrifying. Jason appreciated having a familiar face in the crowd, even if he noticed Solari's tail twitching every time he sat with Era in the dining hall or studied with her in the common area. He didn't mention it, but he caught the way Solari's ears flicked ever so slightly when Era laughed too loudly at something he said, or how her silver eyes lingered on them for a fraction longer than necessary before she returned to whatever she was working on. Despite her initial coldness, living with Solari was surprisingly easy. She was neat, efficient, and didn't fill the room with awkward small talk. If anything, she was too quiet, always watching, always calculating. Jason wasn't sure what she thought of him, but she was outright hostile, which he took as a win. She had a habit of staying up late, stretched out on her platform, scrolling through dense academic texts or reading what looked like political reports. He wasn't sure what she was studying, but from the occasional sharp glances at her communicator, he guessed it wasn't just regular coursework. Every now and then, he'd hear her mutter something in her native tongue, her tail flicking in agitation before she'd sigh and refocus. He wanted to ask, but their unspoken agreement seemed to be, don't pry, don't push, just exist. It worked well enough. That changed the night VES walked in. Jason had just finished a long day of classes and was looking forward to crashing in his bed, but the moment he stepped into the room, he knew something was off. Solari was standing near her side of the room, arms crossed, her entire posture stiff and unyielding. Across from her stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and distinctly not of her species, though with darker slate blue skin and piercing violet eyes that carried a confidence bordering on arrogance. His attire was far too formal for a student. His long, high-collared coat was embroidered with symbols Jason didn't recognize, but the way he held himself, back straight, chin tilted slightly downward, made it clear he was someone important. Jason stopped short, gripping the strap of his bag. He hadn't expected company, judging by the look on Solari's face, neither had she. The man, VES, as Jason would soon learn, cast him a slow, measured look, his expression shifting into something unreadable before turning back to Solari. "This is your human," he said. Jason bristled at the wording, but before he could say anything, Solari exhaled sharply through her nose. "He is my roommate," she corrected, her voice edged with irritation. VES smirked, as if that answer amused him. He took a step closer to Solari, clearly unfazed by her hostility. "Strange, I had expected you to at least request someone more compatible." Jason had no idea what the hell that was supposed to mean, but the dismissive tone in VES's voice was enough to make his jaw tighten before he could speak. Solari took an almost imperceptible step in front of him, positioning herself between him and VES. "This conversation is unnecessary," she said, her voice clipped. "You know my stance." VES tilted his head, looking her over with a gaze that sent every alarm in Jason's brain ringing. There was a familiarity there, an expectation that made Jason's stomach churn. This wasn't some random encounter. These two knew each other, he said. Jason didn't know what to say, but his silence didn't matter because VES turned his attention back to him, his violet eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you even understand what you're involved in, human?" Jason frowned. "Involved in what?" "Of course you don't know." VES chuckled, the sound low and condescending. "I would have expected better from you. Surely this arrangement is beneath you." Solari's hands curled into fists at her sides. "You don't get to decide what is or isn't beneath me." There was a challenge in her voice, and for a brief moment, VES seemed to consider pushing further. But then he sighed, shaking his head as if he were almost disappointed. "Very well," he murmured, stepping back, "but I do wonder how long you plan to keep pretending." "None of this matters." With that, he turned his long coat, swirling around him as he strode toward the door. As he passed Jason, he gave him one last unreadable look before walking out without another word. The moment the door slid shut behind him, the tension in the room snapped like a stretched wire. Jason exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "So, what the hell was that about?" Salari didn't answer immediately. Her shoulders were still rigid, her tail flicking in erratic movements that betrayed whatever she was feeling. Finally, after a long pause, she sighed and walked over to her bed, sinking down with a weariness Jason hadn't seen from her before. "Nothing that concerns you," she said, but there was something in her tone, something unsteady, that said she didn't quite believe her own words. Jason sat on his own bed, watching her for a long moment before leaning back against the wall. "Yeah," he muttered, "I don't believe that." Salari didn't look at him, but she also didn't tell him he was wrong. Jason didn't sleep well that night. His mind kept circling back to VES, to the tension in Salari's shoulders, to the way she had positioned herself between them without even realizing it. There was history there, something deeper than just a casual acquaintance, and the way VES had spoken to him with that smirking arrogance made Jason's stomach twist in a way he didn't like. He wasn't stupid, he had seen this kind of thing before. VES hadn't been asking questions, he had been staking a claim. And the worst part? Salari hadn't denied it. She hadn't snapped back with her usual sharp wit, hadn't called him delusional or scoffed at the idea outright. She had just stood there, tense and unreadable, and that silence had said more than anything else. By the time morning arrived, Jason had barely managed a few hours of sleep, and his mood was as sour as the strange, citrus-like juice he had grabbed from the dining hall. Salari was already awake when he left for class, silent and withdrawn, her silver eyes locked on her tablet as if it contained the answers to the universe. She didn't acknowledge him when he walked past, and for once, he didn't feel like trying to force a conversation. Whatever was going on, she clearly wasn't ready to talk about it, and if she wanted to pretend last night never happened, fine. He had enough to deal with without getting sucked into whatever complicated web she was tangled in. Classes were a blur of incomprehensible alien concepts and barely contained exhaustion. By the time he made it to the library to meet Era, he was running on nothing but stubbornness and a questionable amount of caffeine. She had already claimed a table near one of the wide, fluorescent ceiling windows, her human features standing out starkly against the backdrop of the countless alien students around her. She grinned when she saw him, judging a data pad toward him as he dropped into the seat across from her. "You look like you got run over by a grav car," she observed, propping her chin on her hand. "Rough night." Jason exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You have no idea." Era arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. "Salari still being weird?" "Weirder," he muttered, dragging the data pad closer and pretending to skim the notes she had pulled up for their Xena psychology assignment. "Some guy showed up last night, VS. She knew him, and let's just say he wasn't thrilled about me being there," Era added. Era's expression shifted, curiosity flashing in her dark eyes. "VS, as in VS Carvo?" Jason paused, narrowing his eyes. "I don't know his last name." He was tall, kind of intense, and looked at me like I was a stain on his boot. Era let out a low whistle, leaning back in her seat. "Yeah, that sounds like him. He's kind of a big deal, his family is one of the oldest ruling houses on Vale and Prime, like royalty-adjacent big deal." That didn't sit well, Jason frowned, turning her words over in his head. And he and Salari exchanged a knowing look. If he was showing up at her dorm unannounced, he probably thought she was his, or at least, she was supposed to be. Jason ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I don't like that. I don't like that Salari had a past she clearly wasn't sharing. I don't like that VS thought he had some kind of claim over her, more than anything." He hated the way the whole situation left him feeling unsettled, like he was missing something important. But before he could dwell on it further, a voice cut through the low murmur of the library, sharp and accented. "Jason Ward." His entire body went rigid before he even looked up. Salari stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her tail flicking behind her in that way that meant she was either irritated or uncomfortable, maybe both. Her silver eyes flicked to Era for a fraction of a second before settling on him, unreadable and guarded. Jason set the data pad down, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, we need to talk." There was no question in her voice, no room for argument. Era glanced between them, lips twitching in amusement, before she held up her hands in mock surrender. Right, that's my cue to leave. Try not to kill each other, okay? Jason ignored her as she slid away, watching as Salari hesitated for the briefest moment before sitting down across from him, her usual composure thinner than usual. Neither of them spoke for a long beat, tension stretching between them like an invisible wire. Finally, Salari exhaled, her voice lower than usual when she finally spoke. I assume you have questions. Jason leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You think she didn't rise to the bait? His silver eyes locked onto his with that unwavering intensity that always made it impossible to look away. VS is nothing you need concern yourself with, he scoffed, shaking his head. See, that's funny, because when a guy shows up in my room and acts like I shouldn't be there, I tend to take that personally. Her jaw tightened slightly, but her expression remained neutral. It's complicated, Salari let out a dry laugh, leaning back in her chair. Yeah, no kidding. Salari exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully, which only made him more suspicious. VS and I were once aligned, Jason's stomach clenched, and he wasn't entirely sure why. Aligned, he repeated. That's a nice, vague way of saying we were together. Something flickered across her face, but it was gone before he could decipher it. It was never that simple. My family and mine have long-standing political ties. I assumed those ties meant a certain expectation. Jason narrowed his eyes. An arranged thing? She nodded once in a way. But I never agreed to it, my family. She hesitated, and for the first time, she looked almost uncertain. Let's just say their priorities do not always align with my own. Jason watched her carefully, trying to piece together the missing parts of the puzzle. He had known there was something different about her, something that set her apart from the other students, but he hadn't realized how deep it ran. She wasn't just some random student here on an academic track, she was tied to something bigger, something political, something dangerous. And if VES was part of that world, then Jason was standing on the edge of something he probably had no business getting involved in. But the thing was, he was already involved, whether Salari wanted to admit it or not. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. So what happens now? VES doesn't seem like the type to just let things go. Salari's expression hardened. He won't. Jason nodded slowly, letting the weight of that settle between them. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And somehow, he had the sinking feeling that things were only going to get worse. Jason didn't like feeling out of the loop. He had come to Vale and Prime expecting challenges, new cultures, strange technology, the occasional awkward interaction with beings that didn't understand human customs, but he hadn't signed up for interstellar political drama. And yet, here he was, sitting across from Salari, who had just casually dropped the fact that she had been part of some kind of arranged political alignment with an arrogant noble who seemed to think he still had a claim on her. That didn't sit right with him, but it wasn't his business, or, at least, that's what he kept telling himself. Except it was his business now, VES had made sure of that. The guy had looked at Jason like he was an obstacle, like he was trespassing somewhere he didn't belong. That didn't feel like the reaction of someone who had given up on the idea of claiming Salari, and judging by the way she had stiffened at his presence, Jason was willing to bet that VES wasn't the type to take no for an answer. Salari was watching him now, her silver eyes unreadable, but there was something in the way she sat, not quite tense, not quite relaxed, like she was bracing for something. Maybe for him to push the issue, maybe for him to demand more answers. Perhaps she expected him to back off, but Jason wasn't good at backing off when something didn't make sense, and this whole situation made absolutely no sense. Jason exhaled, rubbing his temples before finally speaking. So let me get this straight, your family wanted you to be with VES because of politics, you didn't, and now he's decided that what he gets to act like is still on the table. Salari's expression didn't change, but there was something tight in her voice when she answered. My family is powerful. Mine is powerful, that is how alliances are made. Jason frowned, narrowing his eyes. That's not an answer. Her tail twitched, curling around the leg of the chair, a nervous habit he was beginning to recognize. She sighed, looking away for a moment before finally answering. Ves and I were expected to form a bond. It was never something I wanted, but expectations are difficult to defy in our world. I came to Vale and Prime to escape that, to create distance between myself and the path my family set for me. But Ves does not like to lose. Jason absorbed that, leaning back in his chair. So what happens now? Salari was silent for a long moment before shaking her head. He will not make things easy. Jason scoffed, crossing his arms. Yeah, I got that much. So what's the plan? Are you just going to ignore him and hope he gets bored? Salari's silver eyes flicked back to his, sharp and assessing. That would be the logical approach. Jason snorted. Yeah, except he doesn't seem like a let it go kind of guy. Her gaze lingered on him for a beat too long before she finally looked away, her tail flicking again. You should stay out of this. Jason rolled his eyes. Oh sure, I'll just pretend the guy didn't walk into our room last night like he owned the place. That seems like a totally realistic option. Salari exhaled through her nose, clearly frustrated. You are not part of this. Jason arched a brow. Tell that to Ves. She didn't have an answer for that, and that, more than anything, told Jason exactly what he needed to know. He was already involved, whether she wanted to admit it or not. They didn't talk much after that, and Jason let it go for the moment, though he knew this wasn't over. The rest of the day was uneventful. If attending classes where half the students had extra limbs or communicated in bioelectric pulses could be considered uneventful, he tried to focus on his coursework, but his mind kept drifting back to Salari, the way she had carefully avoided answering certain questions, the way her tail had curled when he pressed too hard. She was holding something back. By the time he returned to the dorm that night, he had resolved to let it go. If she wanted to tell him more, she would, if not, it wasn't his place to force the issue. He had enough on his plate without getting tangled in whatever political mess she was trying to outrun. But the moment he stepped into the room, he knew something was off. Salari was sitting on her bed, her tail curled tightly around her waist, her expression unreadable. But it wasn't just that, there was something in the air, tension, a static charge that made the small hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He set his bag down carefully, watching her. What happened? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her tablet toward him, and the moment he saw the screen, his stomach dropped. It was a message from Ves, and it wasn't subtle. You should choose your company more wisely. Salari, the human is inconvenient, but I am patient. Jason clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists before he forced himself to relax. Well, that's not creepy at all, he muttered. Salari exhaled, shutting the tablet off. I told you, he will not make things easy. Jason dragged a hand through his hair, packing for a moment before turning back to her. So what do we do? Salari blinked, clearly not expecting the "we" from Jason. Yeah, well, too late for that now. Jason sighed. I get it, this isn't my fight, but Ves seems to think it is, which means ignoring him isn't going to work. So what's the move here? Salari studied him for a long moment before finally, slowly speaking, there is a group of students who believe the university's rules on interspecies relationships are outdated. They work in secret. If Ves escalates, they may be our only option. Jason frowned. Wait, what do you mean, if he escalates? Salari hesitated before finally saying, Ves does not threaten idly. Jason exhaled, shaking his head. Great, fantastic, love that for us. Salari's lips twitched just barely before she sobered again. I will handle this. Jason met her gaze, holding it. Not alone. Something flickered in her expression, annoyance, maybe, or something else entirely, but she didn't argue, and that, Jason thought, was probably the closest thing to trust he was going to get for now. Jason had never considered himself the type to get caught up in secret underground movements, but here he was, standing in the shadowed corner of a dimly lit atrium beneath the university's lower levels, waiting for someone Salari insisted could help them. The place was eerily silent compared to the vibrant chaos of the main campus, and the walls had a faint bioluminescent glow, casting soft pulses of blue and green light that made the shadows dance. It didn't feel abandoned, but it wasn't exactly welcoming either. The whole situation felt like the start of a bad decision, but at this point, what other choice did he have? Salari had been tense ever since their conversation in the dorm, her usual guarded composure cracking just enough for him to see how much VS's message had rattled her. She wouldn't admit it, of course she would rather chew glass than show weakness, but Jason wasn't blind. She was worried, and when Salari was worried, that meant things were worse than she was letting on. Now, as she stood beside him, arms crossed, silver eyes scanning the space with sharp precision, Jason could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him. He wanted to ask what they were walking into, but she had already been frustratingly vague about the whole thing. The silver thread, as she had called them, was more than just a group of students grumbling about unfair university policies. They were active dissenters, pushing back against the administration's outdated stance on interspecies relationships, and apparently, they had access to information that could help them deal with VES before things got any worse. Jason wasn't sure how he felt about it. He hadn't come here to get involved in some grand political struggle, he just wanted to survive the year without making an intergalactic fool of himself. But VES had made it clear that ignoring the problem wasn't an option, and if Jason had learned anything about himself over the years, it was that he wasn't very good at backing down when someone tried to push him into a corner. A soft clicking sound broke the silence, and Jason tensed instinctively, shifting his weight as his eyes flicked toward the source of the noise, a doorway that had been seamlessly camouflaged into the far wall. It slid open with a low hiss, revealing a tall figure stepping into the faint glow of the atrium. Jason immediately knew they weren't human. Their elongated limbs and translucent skin shimmered under the lights, and their eyes, a swirling mixture of shifting colors, lacking any visible pupils, moved with an unsettling grace. Their long coat flowed around them as if caught in a non-existent breeze. Salari, birth, the figure greeted, their voice a mixture of tones, as if multiple speakers were layered on top of one another. I had a feeling you would come. Jason shot a glance at Salari, his stomach twisted slightly at the way the figure had said her name, not with surprise, but with familiarity. Salari inclined her head, her posture still rigid. You're well informed as always, she said. The figure's swirling gaze shifted to Jason, and though they had no pupils, he could feel them assessing him. It wasn't hostile, but it was unnerving. And, you've brought a guest, Jason Ward. Salari's voice didn't betray any emotion. He is involved now, whether he wants to be or not. Jason exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, I've noticed. The figure studied him for another long moment before nodding slightly. I am Lien. I oversee most of the Silver Thread's operation on campus. Their voice carried a strange cadence, as if they were speaking just slightly out of sync with normal time. You are here because of VS's Carvo. Salari's tail flicked slightly behind her, a small, involuntary movement Jason had come to recognize as restrained irritation. He's already trying to assert control over my choices, Lien hummed, the sound vibrating unnaturally in Jason's ears. And what makes you think we have that leverage? Salari's silver eyes narrowed slightly. You wouldn't have let us through that door if you didn't. Lien's lips curved just barely in amusement, flickering in their expression. Fair enough. They gestured toward the passage they had come from, stepping aside. Then, come inside, we have much to discuss. Jason followed Salari through the entrance, stepping into a hidden network of chambers buried beneath the university. The space was far more advanced than he had expected, holographic interfaces lined the walls, and groups of students from different species were engaged in quiet but intense discussions. This wasn't some amateur resistance group, this was something else entirely. Lien led them deeper into the underground complex, stopping in front of a large display projecting rotating images of various students and faculty members. Jason recognized some of them: professors, council members, influential students, but it was the name VES Carvo that stood out. His image hovered beside a long string of data written in a language Jason couldn't read. "We've been tracking VES's movements for some time," Lien said, gesturing toward the screen. "Not because of you specifically, but because he has ties to factions beyond this university. His family's influence runs deep, and their goals do not align with peaceful academic pursuits." Jason frowned. "What does that mean?" Lien turned to face him fully, their expression unreadable. "It means that VES is not just some arrogant noble with an outdated claim, his presence here is deliberate. He is not just monitoring Salari, he is laying the groundwork for something much larger." Salari's expression didn't change, but Jason could feel the shift in the air. She had suspected something, but she hadn't known the full extent of it. "What does he want?" she asked. Lien exhaled slowly. "That is the question we are still answering. But we do know this: he will not let you go, Salari, not because of love, not because of honor, but because you are valuable. And men like VES do not give up valuable things easily." Jason clenched his jaw as the weight of the words settled over him. This wasn't just about some spoiled noble feeling entitled to Salari's presence, this was bigger than that. And if they didn't do something soon, it was going to get worse. Salari was quiet for a long moment before finally saying, "Then I suppose it's time we stop playing defense." Lien smiled just barely. "Now you're thinking like us." Jason exhaled, shaking his head. "Great, love. Where is this going?" Salari shot him a dry look. "You didn't have to come." Jason gave her a flat stare. "Yeah, well, too late for that now." Era's lips twitched just slightly, not quite a smile, but close, and despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the chaos that was bound to come, Jason had the strangest feeling that this was exactly where he was meant to be. Jason wasn't sure when his life had turned into some kind of intergalactic conspiracy thriller, but standing in the hidden base of an underground student movement while discussing ways to undermine an arrogant noble with shadowy ambitions definitely wasn't part of his original plan when he signed up for the exchange program. Yet, here he was, shoulder to shoulder with Salari, staring at a holographic display filled with disturbing details about VES and his family's reach. It was worse than he had thought. VES wasn't just some jealous ex clinging to an outdated claim. He was connected to factions far beyond the university, and if what Lien said was true, he was actively working towards something much bigger than harassing Salari. Jason shifted his weight, crossing his arms as he let the reality of it sink in. He was still processing the fact that the silver thread even existed, let alone that Salari had apparently known about them long before she had decided to bring him in. He wasn't surprised she was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else, but the fact that she had only now decided to include him meant things were worse than she had let on. Lien watched them both with that same unreadable expression, their multi-toned voice eerily calm as they gestured toward the screen. VES's movements have been monitored for months. He's been establishing connections within the university's administrative body, ensuring that certain rules remain enforced, and, more importantly, ensuring that certain people are kept in check. Their swirling, pupilless eyes flicked toward Salari. "You are one of those people, Salari." Salari's silver gaze didn't waver, but Jason saw the way her tail curled slightly around her wrist, a movement so subtle that most people wouldn't have caught it. "But you have always been a problem for him, Salari, not just because you refused his family's arrangement, but because you are influential in ways that extend beyond mere politics. Your name carries weight, and he cannot afford to have you standing on the wrong side of his agenda." Jason exhaled slowly, piecing it together. "So what, he's trying to force her into his corner or remove her entirely?" Lien said simply, "You have been accused. That means you have the right to a formal defense before the committee. If you demand an immediate hearing, they will be forced to address this evidence in public before anyone can suppress it. Jason narrowed his eyes. You're saying I should walk into a disciplinary hearing and throw this in their faces? Lien nodded. Precisely. Jason let out a dry laugh. Fantastic, that won't paint a target on my back at all. Salari finally spoke, her voice steady. VES already sees you as a... Not that I have to explain anything, Jason interjected. You won't be explaining anything. Salari held up her communicator, revealing a new document glowing on the screen. We are. Jason narrowed his eyes. What is that? She met his gaze evenly. Evidence. Jason took a step closer, scanning the file. It was a dossier on VES, his activities, his influence over certain faculty members, his involvement in rule enforcement manipulations. Nothing that was openly illegal, but enough to show a pattern of targeted actions against students he considered inconvenient. Jason let out a slow whistle. You've been holding on to this. Salari's lips pressed together slightly. It wasn't relevant. Then, looking at him, she tilted her head slightly. Now it is. Jason exhaled, nodding slowly. All right, what's the plan? Salari tapped the file. We take this to Lien. The silver thread has connections. We make sure this reaches the right people before VES can control the narrative. Jason smirked slightly. So, we flipped the script. Salari's lips twitched just barely. We make sure it is written correctly. Jason met her gaze, a slow grin forming despite the situation. I like the way you think. For the first time since the meeting, Salari smiled just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As Jason followed her out of the dorm, he had the feeling this fight was only just beginning. Jason knew that the moment they handed over the evidence, there was no going back. This was the moment when everything either fell apart or turned in their favor. He and Salari walked through the dimly lit corridors beneath the university, moving swiftly toward the silver thread's hidden meeting chamber, the air around them thick with unspoken urgency. His communicator still displayed the official suspension notice, the cold, bureaucratic language staring back at him like a death sentence. He knew VES had orchestrated this, twisting the university's policies to frame him as a disruptive influence. And if he and Salari didn't act fast, the committee would rubber stamp his expulsion before he even had a chance to speak. Salari's pace was controlled but tense, her tail flicking behind her in sharp, irritated movements. She was doing that thing again, running through scenarios in her head, calculating every possible move, before they even reached the door. Jason had come to recognize that as her way of dealing with stress, she didn't let emotions drive her, she analyzed, she controlled, she found solutions. When they reached the entrance, the seamless metallic door hissed open, and Lien was already waiting for them. Their ever-shifting, multi-tone voice was calm as they gestured for them to step inside the room, which was dimly lit by floating orbs of bioluminescent energy that cast an otherworldly glow across the walls. The subtle hum of encrypted data being processed echoed softly in the background. You're moving fast, Lien observed, tilting their head slightly, their swirling eyes scanning both of them before settling on Salari. Which means things have escalated. Jason dropped his communicator onto the table between them, the official notice glowing in stark contrast against the dark metal surface. They're trying to kick me out, he said bluntly. VES made his move. Lien barely glanced at the notice before looking at Salari. And I assume you've come with something that will make that difficult for him? Salari didn't waste time with small talk. She produced her own communicator, and the encrypted dossier flickered into a projected display, images, records, conversations, each one a piece of the puzzle that painted a very clear picture of VES's manipulations, his influence, and his calculated efforts to remove perceived obstacles. This is everything we have, Salari said smoothly, her tone unreadable. It won't be enough to bring him down completely, but it will force the committee to hesitate before pushing you out. They value their reputations more than their policies.